So many a times it would have happened with you that some of the relatives or some of your friends would have told you that you look just like your mother or you look just like your father. And if you realize many of the traits, many of the characters that we have, many of the features that we have, the way we look, the eye color, the way we behave, and many other features that we possess are going to resemble either of our father or our mother. So, a simple explanation to this is due to the fact that what we are actually 50% of our father and 50% of our mother. And what regulates this? What tells that yes, we should behave in this manner, we should be formed in this manner, we should look in this manner? The answer is very simple. It is a DNA, it is a chromosome, or it is a genetic material. Now, by now, I'm sure you all will have a basic idea as to what these terms are: DNA, chromosomes, right? So, when we talk about how this genetic material, how this gene or chromosome is getting transferred from one generation to the next, from the parent to the child, right? So, that process is called heredity, right? The process of inheritance of traits. So let us start by defining what heredity means. So heredity refers to the biological process, right? It is a biological process that talks about the transfer of characters or traits from the parents, right, to their offsprings. So first let us understand what do you mean by the term character. Okay, what do you mean by the term character? So in simple, character refers to a feature. Okay, a feature. What kind of feature? This feature is heritable, right? It is going to be heritable. Heritable means what? It is going to be inherited. So any feature that we see in organism that is heritable can be referred to as a character of the organism. So feature that is heritable. Now what do you mean by trait? So there is another word that we are talking about is called the trait, right? That is actually again it is involved with this particular chapter that we're going to learn again and again. So the trait is kind of an variant. It's a form or variant of character. Okay. So what we are saying? We are saying that character is a feature, heritable feature of an organism, and the different forms of the character of a particular character, that is going to be called as trait. To make things simple, let me take an example of this. Right. So when we talk about an example, let's talk an example from, let's say, the plant. Okay. So in plants, there can be a character as, let's say, height of the stem, the length of the stem or the height of the stem. And for that, we can have two different forms, right? Height can be, let's say, tall. It also can be short, or we can say dwarf. So in here, we can say that the height, right? The height here is an character, and the tall and dwarf nature, these are the two traits. These are the two traits. And remember, these are two extreme traits. So we can call these as contrasting trait. Okay, contrasting trait. Now, another example that we can take, again, let's say from the plant, can be, let's say, the seed color, right? Seed color is a character. Now, the seed color, for example, can be of various colors. For example, it can be yellow or it can be green, right? So, here the yellow on and the green, these are the traits where the seed color is the character. Another example from human beings, let's say, which is not going to be the contrasting character. Okay, so to do that, let me talk about a character called skin color. Okay, now the skin color, right, it is not simply like, fair and dark. No, it is not this contrasting, but instead there is a gradient. right? When we talk from fair to dark, it is a gradient that we get. And here it is not only two traits, it is going to be more than two types of traits that can be present. Okay, and here we cannot call these as contrasting trait. It is a wide range of trait that we can see when we talk about some other characters like the skin color. Remember, the character or traits, they're going to be determined, okay, they're going to be determined by the genes. Okay, by the genes. Genes are nothing but these are the segment of DNA. So the segment of DNA or the genes, they are going to regulate, they are going to control, they are going to determine what will be the character or what will be the trait. The DNA or the gene, let's say, is going to give rise to something called the protein, and the protein in turn is going to regulate the character, right? The character or the trait. So that is what you have to understand on the character or trait. And remember, these character or traits are getting passed on from one generation, from the parents to their offsprings. So what we are actually 50% genome of our mother and 50% genome of our father. Now, as the traits are regulated by the gene or by the chromosomes. So we have the cell here, okay, and in the cell we have the nucleus, and the nucleus in turn contain the genetic material, right? The genetic material, right? We must be knowing that the genetic material actually is going to be in the form of chromatin, right? So chromatin is the form when the cell is going to be, right, cell is actually not dividing. So when the cell is not dividing, it is in a form called chromatin. That is the thin thread like structure we call it. Now when the cell is going to undergo the division, right, when there is going to be condensation, right, condensation of this chromosome, when during cell division, it actually forms the structure and it is called chromosome, right? So your chromatin forms the chromosome, right? So the chromosome we are going to see only during cell division and not in any other time. So what makes up the chromosome? So the chromosome is made or it is consisting of DNA and certain positively charged proteins like the histones and some other NHC protein. So your DNA and protein together forms the chromosome. Now the chromosome, it is made up of DNA, sequence of DNA, and a segment of DNA, right, segment of DNA coding for a polypeptide chain, right, that is going to be called a gene, right? So this is how we are going to have the relationship between the protein, DNA, chromosome, chromatin, gene, as you can see here. So how does it all fit in what we are talking about, in what we have to learn in this chapter of heredity and evolution? So dear students, when we are talking heredity, right, we are talking about inheritance of the characters, inheritance of traits. That is, we know that the DNA regulates the characters, right? DNA regulates the character. That is what we are talking about till now. So DNA also, we know that DNA is going to regulate the body structure, in other words, right? So when we talk about the inheritance or transmission of character, what the parent, one thing that the parent and the offspring, they would try to keep the same is going to be the DNA, right? They would like the DNA to be conserved, and during this process, right, so what happens? Cell division has to occur, right? When cell division is going to occur, right, during this process, this is also going to copy the DNA, right? So when the DNA is going to be copied, this process is called DNA replication. So when the DNA is getting copied, there are going to be certain errors, right? And these errors actually give rise to variation, changes at molecular level. These are the changes at molecular level, at a level of DNA. So what actually is variation? Again, as we discussed, right? So variation, right? It is created during reproduction. Okay. Now, second thing. So these variations are formed due to the inaccuracies of DNA copying mechanism, also known as the DNA replication. Right. Now there are going to be a lesser variation, right? Lesser variation in asexual mode of reproduction compared to sexual mode. Now, one of the reasons for this is there is going to be involvement of two organisms in case of the sexual mode. In asexual mode, it is a single organism that is actually involved. So, the amount of variation that is going to be created is going to be higher in case of sexual mode compared to asexual mode of reproduction. Now, question is whether all of these variations are useful. So we are saying we had been talking about variation and we had said that variations are actually useful, right? So variations we can accumulate more and more. That will be more beneficial to the population. But the thing is, not all the variations are important. Not all the variations are good. Not all the variation will help them to, adapt to the environment. But there will be some of these variations that are going to actually be harmful, right? So not all, right? And there are some that are going to be unhelpful. So these variations which are useful, they will help the organism, right, to adapt to the, they will help them to adapt to the environment. So some of the other variations may not be helpful and they might lead to death. So these are the few things that you have to keep in mind when we talk about variations. Again, you have learned about it in the previous chapter also, the variation and the importance of variation. If you remember the bacterial population and the heat wave, right? How some of the bacteria would survive and not all. Only those bacteria had a slight variation from the original one, they could survive. Imagine if all the bacteria had the same set of gene or chromosome without any variation, probably all of them would have died. Again, it's a concept from the previous chapter. I hope you are clear. So one other thing that you all have to keep in mind is the variation is going to be heritable, right? So the heritable variation, as we talked about in the beginning, so variations are going to be heritable. So these variations, they are going to get accumulated. So they are going to be accumulated over generations. So to make you understand that, we are having a particular diagram here, right? Accumulation of variation during reproduction. You have a parent organism here. Now this parent organism is having a particular set of genomes. So this is our parent organism. So once we go from first generation to the second generation, let's say, right? So there is a new variation, right? It's a simple representation just to make you understand the concept of variation. So here what you see is going to be a slight variation compared to the parent. Now this particular variation, it was actually not there in the parent. Now on the other hand, this organism, right, the other progeny, now this also is having a new variation, right? For this second generation, these are new variations, right? Now when this particular organism is going to reproduce, it is going to create another new set of variations. So this is our new variation in the third generation. But what you have to keep in mind, as you can see here, it is having the old variation from the previous generation. So whatever variation had been had been created in the second generation, that is getting transmitted to the next generation along with some new variations. Similarly, here also you can see that there is a new variation, but there is the presence of the previous generation's variations. One simple thing that you have to keep in mind is variations that are going to be created in every generation. Why it is created in every generation? Because in every generation there is going to be cell division. When there is cell division, when there is DNA replication, the variations are going to be created. And these variations, they are going to be transmitted, or they are going to be inherited, transmitted from one generation to the next. And that is what we are talking about, the accumulation of variations during reproduction.